Up Britain, our series which focuses on parenting today. Here's Mariella Frostrup.
Hello and welcome to Bringing Up Britain. This week we tackle a knotty topic that affects not just parents and children, but society as a whole: how to behave well. Good manners used to be first base, the dividing line between civilization and barbarity, but they're increasingly absent in our encounters with fellow citizens. Phone-wielding pedestrians barging into each other without apology, scoffing smelly food and drink as we commute, erupting in road rage and phone centre frustration at the drop of a hat. We adults are not exactly setting a good example. At the same time, attitudes to child-rearing have also altered. We're urged to lavish praise, to let our kids make their own mistakes, to love-bomb them even. So, are we rearing a generation of little savages? How do we get our children to behave? And in 2015, what do we mean by good behaviour? Everyone has an opinion, and they regularly make news headlines. Earlier this month, for example, a survey by the Good Pub Guide found that the single biggest complaint from Britain's pubgoers was not the price of beer, but the presence of badly behaved children who were noisy, disruptive, and out of control, though I'm amazed they noticed over the din of the adults. So, how do we bring up children who, if nothing else, won't spoil our pub lunches? To discuss the many factors that shape behaviour and the different approaches parents might take, I'm joined by Oliver James, clinical psychologist, whose books on parenting include Love Bombing, Reset Your Child's Emotional Thermostat; Bonamy Oliver, co-director of the Nurture Lab, University of Sussex, whose research focuses on family relationships; Professor of Child Health and Behaviour at the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College London, Stephen Scott; and Penny Palmano, whose book, Yes, Please, Thanks, aims to teach children manners, respect and social skills for life. And that's where we'll start. Good manners are often seen as a very basic building block for good behaviour. So I wondered if you could tell me what each of you consider to be the absolute minimum requirement from our children. Oliver?
Well, in our case, I have a 13-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old son. The only thing, pretty much, that we've coerced our children into doing is to saying please and thank you. And in fact, my son has got it off to fine art now. He says, thank you so much at the end. It's quite almost sarcastic. But I do think that it is the one thing that's worth cursing, because the parents really remember it. It gives a completely false impression of how well behaved and conscientious and aware of other people's contributions to their life they are. But it's really worth doing.
So please and thank you, Penny.
Well, please and thank you is the absolute minimum. But, you know, children will behave a lot better if they know how to behave, how they're expected to behave. So I think you've got to teach children to be courteous to others.
Stephen?
I think it's about acknowledging what other people have done for you, quite briefly, but thank you for giving way to me as an adult in a car, and thank you for the meal, even at home as well as to the guests. You can go beyond that and acknowledging what other people's needs are, but when they've made an effort for you, I think that's what good manners is about.
Bonamy?
I think we ought to be careful that we bear in mind situational aspects here. So I do think that sometimes good manners with your friends, good manners with your teachers, good manners with a stranger might be slightly different, but that the minimum is about being appropriate for your situation and the expectations of those you're with.
You mean that sort of look of surprise that most parents can't wipe off their faces when the parents of other children say during a play date, your children were immaculate?
Exactly right.
But let's hear some opinions from our listeners.
I was brought up with good manners. I think it's good to respect people generally. I think it creates a positive, friendly community.
Oh, absolutely important. I think it's basis for good parenting, isn't it? They have to be well behaved and say thank you and please.
Yeah, it's very important, because once they will grow older, they will have all those qualities, and the behavior in the society it's really important for us.
Just say yes, please, and no thank you, I think, is the most important thing.
Table manners, I think, are really important, but also opening and closing doors, your pleases and thank yous, respecting your elders, those sort of generic things I think go a long way in life.
But who should be opening and closing the doors? Maybe we'll come to that later too. Penny, given your emphasis on the importance of good manners, when do you think parents should start teaching their children what to say and do?
As soon as the child starts talking. I mean, even in a high chair when you're giving them food. Please. thank you. And a lot of parents, when the children are quite small, complain that, oh, he won't say thank you, if he has a biscuit. I say, well, the very easiest thing is, don't say what's the magic word. Always tell a child what you expect them, what you want to hear. So the word is please. Would you like a biscuit? Yes, please. And they take it and they don't say thank you. Don't say what's the magic word. Just remove the biscuit. That will focus them fairly quickly on saying thank you, Mummy.
Oliver, I noticed a slight nod of your head in disagreement or agreement there.
Complete disagreement. I mean, to start at the as soon as they can talk. At that age, they should be living in la la land. You should not be making any such requirements on them. They should be play and living in a world of fantasy, and you should not be interrupting that by what I would regard as, to be perfectly frank, completely ludicrous demands on them, which will mean nothing to them. You're creating an empty, pointless ritual if you can coerce them into it, and it would be only through coercion that you could achieve that.
Oliver, I'm not saying you interrupt children, but if you're giving a child something to eat, and you'd say, thank you, darling. And there isn't an alternative to manners apart from badly behaved, badly mannered children.
I think the key point is, what sort of outcome do you want? What kind of child do you want? I want a child who's playful, creative, who challenges the status quo, who thinks for himself and herself, and I do not want a fake marketing character, which is what you're going to get. You're going to have sort of false self if the person is basically forced to adopt this charming persona, and it'll be only a persona, it won't be who they really are.
Bonamy, can you mediate here, seeing as you're from the Nurture Lab? Presume you have. I presume I know where you're coming from.
I'm not sure I can mediate, but what I would say is the advantage of teaching them very young, I think, is that then you're less likely to get the problems that Oliver's talking about. So when they're very young, teaching them that these behaviours are expected, rather than waiting until they're much older, at which point perhaps you're creating a sycophant.
Stephen, an academic view?
And a practitioner view. I'm worried by Oliver's thing that they've just got to express themselves and play, because I see quite a lot of spoilt brats who are very good at being, quotes, their real things. I think our real things, we are social animals. We now know that from the first 24 hours of life, children are very sensitive to cues from other people, so it's all a dance between parent and child. So acknowledging the existence of the other person is part of what they're doing, and how you shape that is, it's all about how it's done.
But it's not just down to pleases and thank yous anyway. Good manners are just one element of good behaviour, and when you're trying to run a household, fostering a basic level of respect and duty perhaps helps a family to function. But during a relationship breakdown, at times of economic uncertainty or other stressful periods, parents can be overtired, overworked or anxious, and children can quickly come to rule a household. Jennifer, who lives near Coventry, is a mother of 2 daughters.
There was quite a lot of friction, especially in the mornings when we had to go to school, because my mum was still getting us dressed in a way, because me and Daisy, we didn't want to put our things on and we didn't really listen to Mum much.
The moment I realised I needed help started back a few years ago. And my youngest daughter Daisy was diagnosed with a muscle wasting disease, which had a great impact on our family day life. From my oldest daughter's point of view, there was a lot less attention, because the amount of time, that was involved of making sure that Daisy was okay, because she was machine fed through the night. And also the relationship broke down between myself and my daughter's dad. So from that moment onwards, I was on my own with 2 daughters and trying to work and do a course all at the same time. It sort of got me really down, and in fact, to be really honest, I went through a bit of a bad patch and had a bit of depression. The impact it had on my girls was the fact that I didn't know how to be a good mum at the time, and I found it really hard to give them the attention that they so deserved.
No one could ever agree, because they didn't really have not set rules, but
there weren't any clear expectations at the time, was there? I was quite irritable, impatient. I didn't quite know how to react to arguments, and that all stems from my upbringing. Unfortunately, when I was 6, I was taken away from my mum. She had mental health problems, and she was an alcoholic, and it was really hard for her to look after us. So from the age of 6, I went to live with my dad. I've never had a stable upbringing. It was either with my mum for 6 years without a dad, or vice versa. And it made me very unsettled. I always felt very insecure.
We'll hear later how Jennifer found a way out of this situation. But first, let's examine what we know about so-called bad behaviour. Many parents struggle to understand why their children behave badly. What are the roots of those moments that can leave us bewildered and despairing? Professor Stephen Scott, can you perhaps guide us in the right direction? Is there an agreed definition of bad behaviour, and how extensive is it?
Yes, there is an agreed definition of difficult, argumentative, rule-breaking, physically aggressive behaviour. Most people agree on it. It's fairly easy to identify, and whatever cut-off you take is going to be arbitrary. But if, for example, you take 5% of kids, are they going to grow out of it? No, they're not. By the time they're adults, the majority will have no exam successes. They will have very violent relationships. They'll have a high criminal records. It matters. It's easy to identify, and it matters a great deal.
And can we differentiate between behaviour which we might expect from every child at some point and more profound disorders? How early can such a difference be identified?
Well, I think aged 3 or 4 you can, because it's about the persistence. It's persistent that it's several times a week, and it's across situations, not just with the parents but in the nursery as well. So, simply put, I think there are 2 routes into so-called bad behaviour. One is, if you're biologically normal but have had erratic, angry parents who can't contain themselves to look after the needs of the children fully, or vice versa. You do have some biologically different children who have things like ADHD and are restless and all around the place, a bit of autism and so on. So that's a different route in.
So, on a percentage level, how much of our children's behaviour would you say comes from us, their parents?
I think it depends in each case. I mean, every child is totally determined by who they are and the parenting, but I think the number of children who it's mainly due to the way they're being brought up might be 70 or 80%, and the number who it's due to the child's biology, for want of a better term, perhaps 20%.
So, Bonamy, just as we feared, 70 to 80% our fault. How parents conduct themselves is obviously central to how children will behave, but is it possible that there are also genetic reasons, strong genetic reasons for such bad behaviour, as Stephen talks about there?
Yeah, absolutely. We know from twin studies and adoption studies and other family studies that genetics are important for child behaviour. Lots of aspects of child behaviour, in fact. But I think what's really important about those kinds of methods for research and what they show is actually that it doesn't mean that it's parents' fault. So what we know from those studies is actually about the importance of the environment. And that can be because we treat them differently, but it can be because they perceive their environments very differently, and that has a big impact on their behaviour.
Oliver, the title of one of your books, which we can't broadcast in full, suggests that the parents have to take a lot of the blame. But how much do you think genes play a role in how children behave?
Well, I'd be interested to know what you'd say about this, because it is a fact. It is not my interpretation or opinion. That the Human Genome Project has been unable to show more than about 1 to 5% for a role for genes. In other words, 99 to 95% is not genes. In other words, there is a missing heritability. The world leader on this subject, Robert Plomin, recently said in The Guardian last year, I've been looking for these genes for 15 years. I don't have any. If Robert says that, it must be true.
Bonamy.
First of all, Robert Plomin from King's College London talks about, in the article that Oliver mentions, the fact that there's this missing heritability, that they're not finding the genes. But
heritability is also a word that we seem to only hear on this programme, as far as I'm concerned. So can you explain what you mean by missing heritability as well?
Sure. So heritability tells us about the extent to which differences in variation in our genetic makeup, as it were, explains variation in behaviour. That's all it says. It's just talking about individual differences. And the missing heritability problem is that when we look for specific genes that explain the heritability we find in things like twin and adoption studies, Oliver's absolutely right, it's not being found. However, we also know that the fact that it's not being found doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It means that we're not finding it yet, and that when we talk about heritability for something like child behaviour, it can be useful for parents to understand that our children's genetic propensities bring something to that relationship.
So, Stephen, forgetting biology. You've mentioned spoilt children right at the top of the programme, and one of the most popular explanations of bad behaviour is that a child has simply been spoiled. Does research bear this out?
Yes, it does, but it doesn't necessarily mean... I mean, you can have some very precious children. Perhaps they've had a terrible illness, or are the only child long wanted, or a child of IVF where you don't feel you can set a limit for them. But often you can inadvertently not set a limit. You can be... your child says, "Oh, I don't want to go to bed," and you say, "No, you've got to go to bed now." And then the child said, "Oh, bother you," stuff that, and you say, "All right, have another 5 minutes," which is a sort of a reasonable thing to do. But inadvertently, you're actually training the child up. If they behave badly, they'll get what they want, and there are lots of studies showing this. So without meaning to, you can train them up to become badly behaved.
Penny?
Well, I think a factor in that is now that you've got both parents working, the mother, they are carrying guilt, and they shouldn't. If they want to work. But all I would say is be a good parent when you are back at home. And the problem is because they feel guilty because they've been away, they tend to buy children more presents, to overcompensate, to show I love you, but I'm sorry I'm not here, and then aren't terribly good parents when they're at home and they are not defining it is now bedtime.
Well, that's not just about mothers, is it? That's about working parents in general, and in fact it's quite an important point, because we talk a lot about parents' influence on children, but of course today, in the wider social context, children are under the influence of all kinds of people, whether it's step-parents, foster parents, whether it's childminders or nursery teachers, and so on and so forth, so the extent of that influence has expanded. What difference do you think that's made, Oliver?
I think the key thing is that you've got a lot of new pressures. You've certainly got a great many more, usually mothers on their own, and the wider society is hugely affecting us all. In the case of many of those single mothers, they're perhaps working on a 0 hours contract. They are absolutely shredded. They maybe got 3 small children. How on earth are they supposed to cope? Now, I'm not saying that I've never completely screamed at my children, because I've lost my temper with them many times. Of course I have. And I'm not saying that anybody doesn't. I suspect everybody does at some point. But I think the key thing is that if you meet their needs, they won't be attention seeking. That if they feel looked after, they will be able to settle themselves. Because what we're really going to be talking about here is self-regulation. How do you help the child to learn how to regulate its emotions, and because they're probably on the same page as you. They probably do actually want to go to bed.
Well, one area in which self-regulation may well be called for is a relatively new arrival into debates about our children's behaviour: screen time, lamenting the way in which children prefer the company of phones, tablets, games, consoles and TV screens, quite possibly all at the same time now, has become the common cry, and inevitably there are questions about how the hours spent in this way affect behaviour. On the other hand, what busy parent has not at some point relied on a screen to pacify a child? We're only human, after all. Research published earlier this month from Cambridge University suggested that an additional hour of screen time each day saw a fall of 2 grades in